Mike, in discerning the potential reality of God, I need to reconcile the various attributes of God and that are necessary for this process to occur. And two of them always seem to fight. One is God's providence, which is supposed to be absolute and perfect, that God is, without any doubt, going to bring about God's purpose. That's one. And the second is absolute human freedom. In an absolute, we say in a libertarian sense, where I'm totally free, not some sort of a, kind of a compatibilistic game where, I'm free because you don't have a handcuff on me or something. When you put those two together, when you force those two together, you get a lot of very strange things coming out. And one of the test cases is from a God's eye point of view, what is the future?
Yeah, so I think from God's point of view, the future is known, right?
Absolutely inviolable.
Yeah. Known absolutely, known inviolably. I guess in the sense that nothing's going to happen that's going to prove God wrong, right? But I don't think that God has determined the future,
okay,
right? So it's not.
So parse those for me.
Yeah. So God knows the future. God knows that the future will turn out a certain way because it is turning out that way, right?
Yeah, God's not forcing it.
Right. God's not forcing it. God's not determining it. At least not the whole thing. I think God acts in history and the things that God does, right?
That's a separate issue.
God sets. But I do think human beings are free. I think that God is able to look ahead and see what we're going to do. I think that God also has what people call middle knowledge, where, in the sort of providential planning of things, God knows what people would freely do if certain circumstances were to turn out, and that's sort of how providence works. Right?
Okay, so you believe in middle knowledge, as the mechanism by which God maintains God's providence and gives some sort of a freedom.
Yeah,
and that's not a distinction without a difference, because God has picked out the world in which God knows exactly what I would do, even though supposedly I was free to do that.
So I don't think it works quite like that. I don't think that God can look at. So I don't think God can look at the space of possible worlds and pick just the one that God wants, right? Because that does leave freedom out of the picture. It's more like God looks at clusters of worlds. So. Clusters of worlds corresponding to total divine actions, right? So suppose, here's one complete story about the things that God does in history. Now, there's going to be a cluster of possible worlds that share that complete story.
Yes,
right?
Of course.
And the cluster of worlds will differ with respect to the free actions and chance events that happen within them, right? But now consider another total story about what God does in history. There's going to be another cluster of worlds that, they're going to differ, right? But they will share in common that total story about what God does in history.
When you say cluster, you don't mean 20 or 30. You mean basically almost an infinite number.
Yeah.
It has to be.
Yeah. I don't have a view about how many, but sure, infinite sounds.
Of course.
And then what God does. So it might be that the world God wants most is this one in this cluster, right? But it might be that God can't get that, because if God were to do this total action, this other world is the one that would be actual, right? So middle knowledge, I think, looks at, here are all the different total stories that God might bring about, and then looks within, each of the different clusters and picks, God knows which world, for each cluster, which world would be actual if God were to bring about that total story. and then makes decisions like that.
Okay, now in each of those specific possible worlds, which God knew before creation and explanatorily before, forgetting about the nature of physical time, explanatorily before God created the world, God had this enormous possibilities of possible worlds and different clusters based on God's, and any one of the ones that God would consider would be would fulfill God's providence. And so the differences in them have to do with how our life. So if you just take me in any of those worlds, in every one of those worlds are all the different ways I would react. Let's say you and me. I would react in each of those possible worlds. God has the possible worlds that fulfill God's plan. So those are the only ones he's going to work with. And then you and I are in all those, happily. And we're different in each of those worlds. So then God is going to pick out worlds that God knows what you and I would do under those circumstances. But there are a lot of different ways that you and I can go. So it's some kind of a conjoint and that now you and me has to be generalized to all human beings who've ever lived, if not more than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what God picks is basically a total story about what God does in the world. And then God knows what world would be actual given that choice.
When we say what God does that include what free creatures do?
No. I mean, so that's how you get, so each cluster is characterized by a different total story about what God does. And then the worlds within each cluster differ based on differences in free human acts, right? So maybe there's...
but God knows that ahead of time through middle knowledge.
What God knows naturally is what all the possibilities are.
Yeah.
What God knows through middle knowledge is which world in each cluster would be actual if God were to have brought about that total story about what God does. Right? But what's up to human freedom is up to human freedom.
But does God know that when he created that, picked that world to be actualized? Does God know what you would do under every circumstance in that world that God was going to actualize, even though God knew what God would do? Did God know what you would do?
Yeah. So
everything.
Yeah, so it's like this.
So he would pick you that he knew would go on to salvation, and God would pick another world that he knew that person X would not go on to salvation.
Yeah. So think of it like that. Here's a very simple total story about what God does. God initiates the Big Bang and then sits back and watches. Okay. So that's one cluster of worlds. All the worlds there differ. They're going to differ wildly based on differences in chance events and free human acts. Right. And God knows which one of those would be actual if God were to do this thing, namely initiate the Big Bang and sit back and watch.
Okay.
And then there's another cluster where God initiates the Big Bang and pushes some particles around for a little bit and then sits back and watches. And a whole different cluster of worlds differing based on free human acts and stuff. And God knows which one of those would be actual if God were to do this, namely Big Bang and then push some particles around. And on and on and on for all the different stories you might tell about what God does. And then what God does is sort of looks like this. If I were to just start the Big Bang, I'd get that world. If I were to start the Big Bang and push some particles, I'd get that world. I like that world better than this world, so I'll choose this act over this act. So that one's out. But then maybe I think the actual world is one where God did a whole lot more than initiate the Big Bang and push some particles around.
Principle the same.
Yeah. And God knew that God would get exactly the world that we have. And that was it might have been that there are other possible worlds that God liked better, but I think, those were inaccessible because there's no total story about what God does that God could have brought about to get that world to be actual. If God had done, for anything God might have done, if God had done that, the favored world wouldn't have been the actual
But
world.
For any given individual, when God actualized that world, God knew ahead of time with 100% certainty that person would do everything in that world.
Yeah.
Again, in which case God knew ahead of time before creation that person A, Mike, would believe in Christianity and go on to salvation, and person B, Robert, would not believe in Christianity and therefore be consigned to whatever non-believers are consigned to. God knew that ahead of time.
Yeah.
It's kind of a scary thought.
Yeah, but I mean, there's the human freedom in there.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And it's
But
not.
God picked that world.
Yeah, and sort of the usual story is that the way divine providence can work is anybody who would freely make a choice for God under some circumstances is going to end up. It's going to work out that they get to they get circumstances under which they'll freely make a choice for God or something like that. I mean, I think that's the usual sort of picture, right? The people who end up not making a choice for a relationship with God are the ones who are such that, roughly put, no matter what God had done, the world that would be actual would be a world in which they freely choose not to have a relationship with God.